Saturday, June 27th, 1863. Lawley had fallen too ill this morning to ride. Consequently, a little before dawn, I took his horse and set off to locate the generals. Having ridden for 8 miles, I reached General Longstreet at 6:30, just as he was preparing to move. Upon my introduction and explanation of my predicament, both he and his officers proved exceedingly courteous. He directed an ambulance to be sent for Lawley, and at once asked me to join his headquarters mess for the duration of the campaign. He informed me, a fact I had not known, that we were now within Pennsylvania enemy territory, Maryland being but 10 miles wide at this spot. He stated that bushwhackers lurked in the forests, shooting unwary stragglers, rendering it unsafe for Lawley and me to travel by ourselves. General Longstreet, an Alabaman, is a sturdily built man of resolute appearance, age 43. Formerly a major of infantry in the old army, he now leads the 1st Corps d'Armée. He remains close to General Lee, who places great weight on his counsel. Among the men, he is reputed to be the finest combat officer in the army. When the topic of being on enemy ground arose, he remarked to me that while it might be considered just retribution to use the torch, such actions would demoralize the troops and destroy their currently superb discipline. Private property was therefore to be strictly respected. By 7 o'clock, I was returning with an orderly, or courier as they are termed, to the farmhouse where I had left Lawley. Once I saw the ambulance arrangements were properly settled, I rode on at a leisurely pace to rejoin General Longstreet near Chambersburg, a town in Pennsylvania situated 22 miles from Hagerstown. I accompanied Mallory's division and noted that as soon as they crossed into Pennsylvania, the men began tearing down fences and broadening the road by some 20 yards on either side, allowing the wagons and the column to advance together. This was the sole act of damage I witnessed from the Confederates. This region of Pennsylvania is prosperous, well-tilled, and relatively densely populated compared to the southern states. However, with all livestock and horses taken by Ewell, all farm work had now ceased entirely. While passing through Greencastle, we saw every house shuttered, the residents in their best clothes standing at their doorways and observing the soldiers with marked hostility. I witnessed no stragglers entering homes, nor were any townspeople bothered or insulted by the troops. Sentinels were posted at the doors of many finer homes to stop any officer or soldier from entering on any grounds. I reached Chambersburg at 6 in the evening. It is a town of considerable size and standing. Every building was closed, but the citizens were on the streets or at their upper windows, glowering in confused resentment at the Confederate soldiers marching briskly past to the strains of Dixie's Land. The women, many of whom were attractive and finely clothed, were especially bitter and unpleasant in their comments. I overheard one remark, "Look at Pharaoh's army going to the Red Sea." Others were pointing and mocking Hood's ragged men who were marching by at that moment. This division, famed for its martial prowess, is made up of Texans, Alabamians, and Arkansans, and they are indeed a peculiar-looking group. They bear the least baggage of any unit. Many possess only an old scrap of carpet or a rug as kit. Numerous men have lost their shoes to the mud. All are tattered and soiled, yet they are brimming with high spirits and faith in themselves and in their commander, General Hood. They responded to the many jeers from the ladies of Chambersburg with good-natured shouts and laughter. One woman had chosen to decorate her substantial bosom with a large Yankee flag, and she stood in her doorway, her face showing the utmost disdain for the barefooted rebels. Several companies passed her without comment, but eventually a Texan solemnly observed, "Take care, madam, for Hood's boys are mighty fine at storming breastworks when the Yankee colors is on them." Following this comment, the patriotic lady made a hasty retreat. Guards were stationed at all the important houses, and the town was emptied of everyone except soldiers marching through or stationed there. Some regiments continued straight through the town and made camp on the Carlisle Road. Others turned off to the right and took position on the Gettysburg Turnpike. I found Generals Lee and Longstreet camped on that latter road, 3/4 of a mile from Chambersburg. General Longstreet and his staff immediately welcomed me into their mess, and I was made known to Major Fairfax, Major Latrobe, and Captain Rogers of his personal staff, as well as to Major Moses, the chief commissary, with whom I am to share a tent. He is the most cheerful, entertaining, and sharp-witted son of Israel I have ever had the pleasure to encounter. The remaining officers on Longstreet's headquarters staff are Colonel Sorrell, Lieutenant Colonel Manning, the Ordnance Officer, Major Walton, Captain Gorey, and Major Clark, all of them capital fellows and most generous hosts. Lawley is to be quartered with 3 medical officers from the headquarters staff. They are named Cullen, Barksdale, and Maury. They constitute a merry trio and maintain a far more comfortable establishment than their generals do. Major Moses informs me that his instructions are to force open the shops in Chambersburg and take all supplies required by the Army in a formal, official way, providing payment in Confederate currency against a signed receipt. The merchants have no doubt removed their most valuable stock with the Confederates' approach. A great deal was also taken earlier by Ewell, who came through almost a week ago. But Moses was quite delighted at having already found a considerable store of fine felt hats concealed in a cellar, which he appropriated immediately. I was given the figures of the men who have crossed the Potomac this evening, along with the count of artillery pieces. There is a substantial ammunition train, for if the Army pushes further into enemy territory, General Lee cannot hope to maintain his lines of communication to the rear. As the staff officers remark, in every engagement we must capture as much ammunition as we expend. This requirement, however, does not appear to concern them, as it has been their customary method of operation up to now. Following the seizure of Winchester, Ewell pushed quickly into Pennsylvania and has already dispatched back large numbers of horses, mules, wagons, cattle, and other essentials. He is now at, or beyond, Carlisle, requisitioning from the countryside and making Pennsylvania sustain the conflict instead of impoverished, exhausted, and depleted Virginia. The Corps of Generals A.P. Hill and Longstreet are now close to this location, all very confident and in excellent morale. Sunday, June 28, 1863. No officer or soldier below the rank of general is permitted to enter Chambersburg without a special pass from General Lee, which he is most reluctant to issue, and I hear of even high-ranking officers being denied this permission. Moses went into town at 11 o'clock with an official demand for 3 days' rations for the entire army in this vicinity. These supplies he is authorized to take by force if they are not given willingly. I was presented to General Hood this morning. He is a lean, tall man with a wiry frame, a serious countenance and light-colored beard, age 33, and is considered one of the most capable and rising officers in the Army. He is worshipped by his Texan and Alabamian soldiers. He previously led the Texan Brigade, but has since been elevated to command a division. His men have a reputation for being a wild lot and hard to control, and it is a chief aim of the commanders to curb their natural tendency to plunder by every possible method. I went into Chambersburg at midday and discovered Lawley settled in the Franklin Hotel. Both he and I encountered great difficulty gaining entry to the building, the doors being locked and only opened with extreme wariness. Lawley had endured a very arduous journey in the ambulance yesterday and was thoroughly worn out. No one at the hotel would pay him the least attention, and all glared at me most unpleasantly. Half a dozen Pennsylvanian harridans surrounded and berated me with a combined volley of words to a deafening extent. Nor would they accept my word when I stated I was an English observer and not a fighter. They insisted I must be either a rebel or a Yankee, an expression which taught me for the first time that the term Yankee is employed as an insult in Pennsylvania, just as it is in the South. The appearance of gold coin, which I exchanged for their paper money, produced a shift in their manner, and they gradually became quite friendly. They appeared profoundly ignorant, confusing Texans with Mexicans. After ensuring Lawley was reasonably comfortable, I walked through the town and observed the forcible confiscation procedures of Moses and his agents. Neither the town's mayor nor any civic officials could be located, nor were the keys to the main stores produced, until Moses started to enforce his authority. The townsfolk were idling listlessly in the streets and displayed little overt resentment. They had delegated the job of opposing the commissary officers to their women, a responsibility which the latter were thoroughly equipped to undertake. No soldiers were seen in the streets except those officially posted. That evening I visited Lawley again, and discovered in his quarters an Austrian officer, wearing the complete uniform of the Hungarian hussars. He had obtained a year's leave and had just managed to cross the Potomac, though not without considerable trouble and hardship. When he mentioned his plan to wear his uniform, I described to him the unvarying habit of the Confederate soldiers, who never let the slightest oddity of dress or manner go by without a flood of jesting, which, though meant in fun, eventually grows rather tiresome. I went back to camp at 6 o'clock. Major Moses did not return until very late, quite dejected by the poor results of his task. He had searched all day with relentless energy and had suffered much abuse from the Union ladies, who labeled him a thieving little rebel scoundrel, among other scornful names. Yet this bothered him less than the fact that everything he needed had been either removed or concealed in private dwellings, which General Lee's orders forbade him from searching. He had only succeeded in securing a supply of molasses, sugar, and whiskey. Poor Moses was completely worn out, but he bore the teasing of his fellow officers with good grace, and they kept asking him to repeat the insults he had received. He remarked that at first the women rejected his Confederate money with great contempt, but they eventually became very particular about the odd cents in change. Monday, 29th of June, 1863. We remain at Chambersburg. Lee has published an exceptionally sound order against retaliation, which is mostly well regarded, though I have heard some grumbling from ardent hotheads who desire vengeance for injuries suffered. And when one reflects on how many officers and men in this army have been utterly ruined by the depredations of Northern forces, one can scarcely wonder at such sentiment. I went into Chambersburg again and observed the notably restrained conduct of the troops toward the inhabitants. I overheard soldiers remarking to each other that they disliked being in a town where they were so naturally hated. To anyone who has witnessed, as I have, the ravages inflicted by Northern troops on Southern towns, this self-control seems highly admirable and unexpected. Yet these Pennsylvania Dutch show not the slightest gratitude, and indeed seem wholly ignorant that their own armies have for 2 years treated Southern towns with tenfold greater severity. This region of Pennsylvania is largely inhabited by descendants of Germans who speak an incomprehensible tongue. They are the most apathetic people I have ever encountered, and they openly declare they care not which side prevails so long as they are left in peace. They condemn Lincoln vehemently. Naturally, in an army of this size, there are bound to be many bad characters, always prepared to loot and steal whenever they can avoid detection. The stragglers, too, who linger after the army departs, will undoubtedly commit much mischief. This is impossible to prevent entirely, yet every possible measure is taken to safeguard private property and civilians, and I can attest from personal witness with remarkable effect. I have heard tales, however, of soldiers who, encountering well-dressed citizens, have reached out and swapped hats, greatly to the latter's irritation, which turns to greater annoyance when a trade of boots is also suggested. Their fine broadcloth coats are never under any threat. General Longstreet is normally a man of very few words, but this evening he and I conversed at length about Texas, where he was stationed for a long period. He recalled many individuals whom I had met quite clearly and was much entertained by my account of traveling through that country. I praised to him the manner in which the Confederate sentries performed their duty, remarking that they were every bit as strict as, and far more courteous than, regular troops. He answered with a laugh that a sentry, having denied you entry to a camp, might very well, if courteously approached, direct you to an alternate route by which you could avoid encountering any sentry entirely. I met General Pendleton and General Pickett today. Pendleton is the Army's chief of artillery and a graduate of West Point. Yet in more tranquil times, he holds the position of an Episcopal clergyman in Lexington, Virginia. Unlike General Polk, he combines both the military and clerical professions and continues to deliver sermons whenever an opportunity arises. On such occasions, he wears a surplice over his uniform. General Pickett is in command of one of the divisions within Longstreet's corps. He wears his hair in lengthy curls and is on the whole rather a reckless-looking fellow. He is the same officer who, as Captain Pickett of the United States Army, was prominent in the dispute between the British and American forces during the San Juan Island affair under General Harney 4 or 5 years ago. Tuesday, 30th of June, 1863. This morning, before the column marched from Chambersburg, General Longstreet presented me to the Commander-in-Chief. General Lee is, with very few exceptions, the most distinguished-looking man of his years I have ever encountered. He is 56 years old, tall, broad-shouldered, very well-proportioned, of excellent posture, a complete soldier in bearing, and his manners are exceedingly polite and marked by dignity. He is in every aspect a perfect gentleman. I suppose no man has so few enemies or is so widely respected. Across the entire South, all concur in judging him to be as close to perfection as a man can attain. He has none of the minor vices, such as tobacco, liquor, chewing, or profanity, and his most severe critic has never charged him with any of the graver ones. He typically wears a much-used long gray jacket, a tall black felt hat, and blue trousers stuffed into his Wellington boots. I never saw him carry any weapons, and the sole indication of his military rank are the 3 stars upon his collar. He rides a fine horse which is exceptionally well cared for. He himself is very meticulous in his attire and person, and on the most demanding marches he always appears tidy and clean. I noted this during the 3 days of combat at Gettysburg, and in the withdrawal afterward, when everyone else looked and was exceedingly grimy. In the old army, he was consistently regarded as one of its finest officers, and when these troubles began, he held the rank of lieutenant colonel in the 2nd Cavalry. He was a wealthy man, but his handsome property was among the first to be captured by the enemy. I understand he has not slept inside a house since assuming command of the Virginian Army, and he consistently refuses all offers of hospitality for fear the person making the offer may later face difficulties for having given shelter to the rebel general. The relationship between him and Longstreet is quite affecting. They are nearly always in each other's company. Longstreet's corps occasionally grumble about this, as they remark that they rarely get an opportunity for independent duty, which falls instead to the lot of Ewell. It is impossible to gratify Longstreet more than by speaking well of Lee. I consider these 2 generals to be as lacking in personal ambition and as completely selfless as any men alive. Both deeply desire a successful conclusion to the war so that they may withdraw into private life. Stonewall Jackson, until his death, the 3rd in command of this army, was just such another plain-hearted servant of his country. It is generally known that General Lee is a devout man, though not so outwardly expressive in that regard as Jackson, and unlike his late comrade, he belongs to the Church of England. His only faults, as far as I can tell, stem from his excessive kindness of heart. Some Texan soldiers were ordered into Chambersburg this morning to destroy several barrels of fine whiskey which could not be transported. This was a rather severe test of their discipline, and they did consider it rather unjust that the sole occasion they were permitted into the enemy's town was for the purpose of destroying their cherished whiskey. Nevertheless, they performed their duty like reliable soldiers. We marched 6 miles along the road towards Gettysburg and made camp at a settlement called, I believe, Greenwood. I rode Lawley's old horse while he traveled in the ambulance with the Austrian and the doctor. During the march, General Longstreet informed me that he had just received news that Hooker had been replaced and that Meade was appointed in his stead. Naturally, he was acquainted with both men from the former army, and he states that Meade is a man of honor and good standing, though possibly not as aggressive as Hooker. I conversed at length with several officers regarding the imminent battle, which clearly can now only be postponed a short while, and which will occur on this road instead of toward Harrisburg, as we had previously assumed. Ewell, who has requisitioned supplies from York as well as Carlisle, has been instructed to regroup. Everyone, as expected, expresses certainty. I observed that it would be advantageous for them on this occasion to have cavalry capable of pursuing shattered infantry should they manage to defeat them. But to my astonishment, they all described their own cavalry as inadequate for such a role. Indeed, Stuart's troopers, though adept at conducting raids, capturing wagons and supplies, and severing communications, appear to have no conception of charging infantry under any conditions. Unlike the cavalry serving with Bragg's army, they carry sabers, but seem to have little notion of employing them. They prefer to rely on their carbines and revolvers. They often ride with their swords tucked between their left leg and the saddle, which presents a rather odd sight, though their horses are mostly good and they are competent riders. The infantry and artillery of this army do not appear to hold the cavalry in very high regard and frequently mock them. I was compelled to leave my horse here, as he was now lame in 3 legs and also had a severely sore back. Wednesday, July 1st, 1863. We did not break camp until noon, as almost the entirety of General Hill's corps had to march past our location on its way toward Gettysburg. A division of Ewell's corps also had to link up a little beyond Greenwood, and Longstreet's corps was required to form the rear. During the morning, I became acquainted with Colonel Walton, who formerly led the famous Washington Artillery, but now serves as Chief of Artillery for Longstreet's Corps d'Armée. He is a large man, a licensed auctioneer in New Orleans, and I gather he longs to return to his gavel. Shortly after setting off, we entered a pass in the South Mountain, an extension, I believe, of the Blue Ridge chain, which is intersected by the Potomac at Harper's Ferry. The scenery through the pass is quite impressive. The first troops we rode beside were from Johnson's division of Ewell's corps. Among them, I saw for the first time the famed Stonewall Brigade, previously commanded by Jackson. In their appearance, the men differ little from other Confederate soldiers, except that the brigade may include more older men and fewer youths. All, save for one regiment, I think, are Virginians. Having been almost continually on separate duty, few of them knew General Longstreet personally, only by repute. Many of them asked me if the general riding ahead was Longstreet, and when I replied that he was, numerous men would run forward 100 yards just to get a proper look at him. I consider this a significant compliment from any soldier on an extended march. By 2 in the afternoon, the sound of firing became clearly audible ahead, and though it grew louder as we advanced, it did not seem exceptionally heavy. A scout traveling with us insisted that a considerable force of Yankees was in or near Gettysburg, claiming he had been among them just 3 days prior. After passing Johnson's division, we came upon a Florida brigade, which is now in Hill's corps. But having served under Longstreet before, the men knew him well. Some of them, after the general had passed, shouted to their comrades, "Look out for work now, boys, for here's the old bulldog again." By 3 o'clock, we began to encounter wounded men coming to the rear, and their numbers soon multiplied rapidly. Some hobbling alone, others on stretchers borne by the ambulance corps, and still others in the ambulance wagons. Many of the latter were nearly naked and exhibited terrible wounds. This sight, so shocking to anyone unaccustomed to it, produced no visible effect whatsoever upon the troops advancing toward the front, who certainly go into action with the utmost composure. They display no eagerness or agitation, only complete indifference. This is the result of nearly 2 years of constant fighting. We now began to pass Yankee prisoners being brought to the rear in sizable groups. A great number of them were injured, yet they appeared already to be on quite friendly terms with their guards, with whom they had begun exchanging canteens, tobacco, and so on. Among them was a colonel from Pennsylvania, a pitiful sight due to a wound across his face. In response to a question, I heard one of them say with a chuckle, "We're pretty near whipped already." We then passed a Confederate soldier carrying a Union flag, belonging, I believe, to a Pennsylvania regiment, which he informed us he had just taken. At 4:30, we caught sight of Gettysburg and joined Generals Lee and Hill, who were positioned atop one of the ridges which characterized the terrain surrounding Gettysburg. We observed the enemy retreating up one of the opposing ridges, hotly chased by the Confederates with loud shouts. The ground onto which the enemy had been forced was clearly a formidable one. His right seemed to be anchored on a cemetery atop a high ridge to the right of Gettysburg from our perspective. General Hill now approached and told me he had felt quite ill all day, and indeed he appears very frail. He stated that 2 of his divisions had been engaged and had driven the enemy 4 miles back to their current position, taking a great many prisoners, several cannon, and some colors. He added, however, that the Yankees had fought with a tenacity not typical of them. He indicated a railway cut where they had made a stout defense. Also a field in the center of which he had watched a man plant the regimental flag, around which the regiment had battled for some time very stubbornly, and when at last it was forced to withdraw, the color-bearer retreated last of all, turning around periodically to shake his fist at the advancing rebels. General Hill said he felt genuinely sorry when he saw this brave Yankee meet his fate. General Ewell had arrived at 3:30 on the enemy's right, with a portion of his corps, and had completed their rout. General Reynolds, reported to be one of the best Union generals, was said to have been killed. While we were speaking, a message came from General Ewell, requesting that Hill press the enemy in front, while he did the same on their right. The pressure was therefore applied in a limited manner, but the enemy was too strongly positioned, and it was too late in the day for a full assault. The town of Gettysburg was now held by Ewell and was filled with Union dead and wounded. I climbed a tree in the most advantageous spot I could locate and could get a reasonably good sense of the enemy's position. Although the crests of the ridges being covered with pine woods, it was very hard to discern any troops concealed within them. The firing stopped around nightfall, at which time I rode back with General Longstreet and his staff to his headquarters at Cashtown, a small village 8 miles from Gettysburg. At that hour, troops were streaming along the road and being directed toward the positions they are to hold tomorrow. In today's action, nearly 6,000 prisoners had been captured, along with 10 guns. Roughly 20,000 men must have been on the field on the Confederate side. The enemy had 2 Army Corps engaged. All the prisoners belong, I think, to the 1st and 11th Corps. This day's action is referred to as a brisk little scuffle, and everyone expects a major battle tomorrow. I noted that the artillery drivers responsible for the horses excavate small pits resembling graves, heaping the soil at the higher end. They take shelter in these pits when under fire. During supper tonight, General Longstreet described the enemy's position as exceedingly strong. He also remarked that they would undoubtedly fortify themselves extensively overnight. I have strong cause to believe the engagement occurred earlier than planned, and that neither Lee nor Longstreet had intended it to begin on that day. I further suspect their designs were disrupted by the events of the 1st. The staff officers spoke of the coming battle as inevitable, and the prevailing sentiment throughout the Army was one of deep disdain for an opponent they have so frequently defeated and under such varied hardships. Thursday, July 2nd, 1863. We all rose at 3:30 in the morning and breakfasted a little before daybreak. Lawley insisted on riding, despite his poor health. A captain and I found ourselves short of horses, but I was provided one by Major Clark of this staff, while the portly Austrian was mounted by Major Walton. The Austrian, despite the early hour, had shaved his cheeks and trimmed his mustache as finely as if on parade in Vienna. Colonel Sorrell, the Austrian, and I reached the same commanding vantage point we occupied yesterday at 5 o'clock, and I climbed a tree alongside Captain Schreibert of the Prussian Army. Directly below us were Generals Lee, Hill, Longstreet, and Hood, seated in conference, the 2 latter aiding their deliberations by the truly American practice of whittling sticks. General Heath was also there. He was wounded in the head yesterday, and though not permitted to command his brigade, he insisted on coming to the field. At 7 o'clock, I rode over a section of the ground with General Longstreet and watched him deploying Malloy's division for today's action. The enemy held a series of elevated ridges, the crests of which were wooded, but the intervening valleys between their ridges and ours were largely open and partly cultivated. The cemetery was on their right, and their left appeared to anchor on a tall, rocky hill. The enemy's forces, now believed to include almost the entirety of the Potomac Army, were concentrated into a space seemingly no more than 2 miles in length. The Confederates enclosed them in a kind of semicircle, and the full extent of our position must have been at least 5 to 6 miles. Ewell was on our left, his headquarters in a church with a high steeple at Gettysburg, Hill in the center, and Longstreet on the right. Our ridges were likewise wooded with pine on their summits and generally on their rear slopes. The artillery of both sides faced each other at the margins of these tree lines, the infantry being entirely concealed. The enemy was clearly dug in, but the Southern troops had not constructed any works at all. A complete silence prevailed until 4:45 in the afternoon, and no one could have guessed that such masses of men and such powerful artillery were about to begin their destructive work at that hour. Only 2 of Longstreet's divisions were present today, McLaws's and Hood's, Pickett's still being to the rear. As the entire morning was clearly to be spent positioning the troops for the assault, I rode to the far right with Colonel Manning and Major Walton, where we ate large amounts of cherries and secured some corn for our horses. We also bathed in a small creek, though not without some apprehension on my part, for we were nearly beyond the lines and vulnerable to the enemy's cavalry.